Berkeley Law School, Boston Fair Housing Commission, and the U.S. Department of Labor. It is in fact, a labor of love that all these organizations get together every year and work to plan this conference, and have persevered over and through the pandemic to continue to engage on what is an essential topic for us all. Just a little bit about me. John mentioned I'm the CEO of Wayfinders, and Wayfinders, as John mentioned as well, is a regional affordable housing and community development organization serving Western Massachusetts. We've been in existence for a little over 50 years now, and started out in our very early days focused on housing affordability and demonstrating an effort that turned into what became the federal Section 8 program, and also working on fair housing issues. So it is true to the core of our organization, and in fact, to the core of the work that many of us do. Fair housing is a core pillar of housing justice and equity. As all of us know, with the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, it set us on a path to trying to identify, address, and in the best case, and best circumstances, repair harm done via housing discrimination and more. That said, there's still a lot of work to do in this arena. We're on a journey that is not nearly complete and may never be complete. But I want to thank all of you for your engagement, your willingness to be here at this conference and to do the work that you do, for your vigilance, and for the actions you take, not only through this conference, but every day in many of your lines of work to further fair housing around the country. So I hope that this conference supports your understanding and work as you go forward. And I welcome you all to the conference and to what I'm sure is going to be an excellent session with our speaker, Mr. Lassiter from the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. I'll turn it back over to John to provide a more formal and complete introduction.
And thank you so much, Keith. And so, yes, I could probably almost say, I probably almost have an easier time saying what Chad Lassiter hasn't done, or where he hasn't been at one time or another. He is the current executive director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, has been for at least the past 4 years, I believe it is. And during all of this time has really been involved in pushing the Commonwealth forward in spaces of DEI training, unconscious bias, anti-racism training. He developed and launched the No Hate in Our State town hall to address the surge of white nationalism in Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, not just Pennsylvania, but everywhere. He has worked to provide really an outlet for the people of Pennsylvania to deal with issues of racism, racial profiling, racial reduction response team. He oversees a staff of 87 people with 3 regional offices and so forth. He's developed programs on global social justice. He is recipient of the A. Philip Randolph Award for his work at the University of Pennsylvania's Martin Luther King Jr. Community Involvement Award. He is also co-founder and president of the University of Pennsylvania's School of Racial Policy and Practice, Black Men at 10, and the first Ivy League Black state group of social workers. Since 2003, this group has sought to recruit Black males to the profession. He's been recognized by the Pennsylvania Tribune as the most important African-American leader from 2010 to 2022, and was who's who among African Americans in the 17th edition, which included such notables as Colin Powell and also Michael Jordan. I've yet to see Chad try to sink a basket, but I'll take it for granted that he might be able to. I could go on with all of his various awards, but I think I'm just really wasting your time. Chad is just always a real pleasure to hear, and it's my pleasure to introduce him at this time.
Thank you so much, John. first and foremost, I want to say how honored and humbled I am to be in this space for the third year in a row. Want to also say to everyone that's on this virtual this afternoon, but that also registered for the conference, a happy 17th conference. This is the 17th year of this conference, and it's just getting stronger each year. Want to also say happy Fair Housing Month to all of us, right?
Yes.
We are fighting for fair housing for all citizens in our democracy. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge our ASL colleagues. Such a gift to humanity. Is always important to have ASL in these virtual spaces, but also in the physical spaces. I want to thank Wayfinders once again for extending the invite to me. And specifically, I want to thank John Fisher and I want to thank Jamie Williamson for their friendship, their expertise, their advice, their recommendations in my role as servant leader here at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. May 5th will be 5 years that I have been in this assignment. Secondly, I'm looking forward to an interactive conversation this afternoon where we will be participating and putting some things in the chat. My goal today is to be as transparent as I always am. I will share with you that I was so looking forward to being in person for this conference. I understand that we're unable to be in person, but I'm an energy person. Over the past 3 years, I must admit that I have suffered from racial fatigue, racial trauma, pandemic fatigue, virtual fatigue, but also self-care. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm a licensed social worker. So I do understand what self-care looks like. I'm always promoting self-care, mindfulness, and wellness in the workplace at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and not just in theory, but also in practice. Also, there may be some times where some things that we're talking about today may trigger you. I would ask, as John stated, that if you need to be off camera, do so. If you need to step away, do so as well. I will share with you that as I get through this presentation, I may be triggered by some things, given the context of being a wounded healer. There is this unique calling that is on my life where I embrace the scars and the suffering of all people. So though I live in the Black body, I'm just as concerned about anti-Semitism, xenophobia, homophobia. I'm concerned about gun violence in the city of Philadelphia, my hometown, where I'm at right now, of Black males killing Black males. But I'm also upset and challenged in our democracy with regards to the things that are happening in rural America, suburban America, urban America. So if at some point in time you see a teardrop, do understand that in the levels of Greek mythology, there is a concept called the wounded healer, to which I belong to that tribe of those of us who are wounded, but who are also healing. John, if we can start with the PowerPoint.
Yes, give me just a second here and I should have it up. Now, can you see it here?
Yes, I see it here. And
Okay.
the title of this presentation this afternoon is Changing the Narrative in a Crumbling Democracy, a Paradigm Shift Towards Justice and the Beloved Community. I believe that there are a lot of narratives that are out in our society at the present time. And I think that we have to speak back to the narratives through storytelling, through qualitative and quantitative data, through policy, through activism, through agitation. And we do so within the context of the 3 pillars of the civil rights movement, which are truth, love, and kindness. Truth, love, and kindness. Truth, love, and kindness. And so that's why I titled this In a Crumbling Democracy, a Paradigm Shift Towards Justice and the Beloved Community. The beloved community comes out of the tradition of Rabbi Abraham Yeshua Heschel and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Next slide. The Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission most recently, last year, celebrated 67 years. We're now in our 68th year. That's a cover of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission annual report. We will make this report readily available after this presentation concludes. We'll send it to John. We'll send a PDF as well as a digital book of the annual report, so you can just see how we're attempting to create the beloved community within the confines of the Commonwealth, but also within the confines of our democracy, bridging Pennsylvania with a global ideology of peace, truth, and kindness. So I mentioned self-care. Since the last time we've seen one another, if we can go to the next slide, I got married. Since the last time we saw one another. This is my wife, Stella Lassiter. Thank you. This is my wife, Stella Lassiter. We went to high school together in 1986. We graduated from high school in 1990. I can lie and say legend had it, but I was not so good at math when I was in high school. So in a ninth grade math class, to deflect my inadequacies, I was very discoordinated. So when John mentioned basketball, I couldn't play basketball if you put me on the court, put the ball in my hand, because I was so clumsy. I am who I am. I'm just an avid reader, an avid intellect. But in high school, because I was so bad in math, I wanted to deflect the attention off of the fact that I wasn't good at math, that I got on one knee and I proposed to her. In ninth grade, I asked her to marry me, and she said, "Chad Lassiter, stop playing, get up and stop playing." And my math teacher told me, "Sit down," and I was a class clown in math. But I share this story because we graduated in 1990. I went off to Johnson C. Smith, HBCU in Charlotte, North Carolina. She went off to college, and we had lost contact with one another all those years until 6 years ago. We reconnected, and this is my soulmate. This is the person who pours into me. This is my leader. This is the person who makes sure that I'm covered in prayer, thoughts, and reflections. And this is the person that tells me, take it down. And is the person that also discovered that I had 2 additional cell phones on top of the 2 that I already had. So I had a total of 4 cell phones. Next slide, please. This is the beautiful bride on our wedding day, which was June 11th of last year. Next slide. I attribute the lifestyle change to Jamie Williamson, who about 2 years ago, I was roughly around 360 pounds. I'm down to 245. When I told Jamie that I reconnected with my soulmate, Jamie got on me about my weight and my love affair for orange slices and everything that has sugar in it. So this is me a little bit slimmed down, but more importantly, this picture really represents being fit for the race to fight for justice on behalf of all those that have been discriminated against on every side of the color line and gender line. The intellectual stamina is there, but I certainly needed the physical stamina as well. Next slide. Surrounding myself with the 3 S's, a spiritual support system. This is the brotherhood. These are individuals that are either related to me or have been friends of mine for over 30 years. You have Secretary John Wetzel, who's longest standing Secretary of Corrections in Pennsylvania history. You have Dr. Greg Seaton, who's a tenured professor at the College of New Jersey. You have Keenan Smith, who just retired, was a special agent with the Department of State Security. He headed up the details of Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Susan Rice, and you have a couple of principals in there. My cousin Mike Jones, my cousin Anthony Horton, retired with the Armed Services, Randy Barnes, who's a chemical engineer, and just really, really great guys. So I just wanted to set the context of just needing that support system, and we all need those support systems. So let's jump into what we're here to discuss today. If we can go to the next slide, John. W.E.B. Du Bois, the African-American sociologist, the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard University, studied at Oxford, penned the Philadelphia Negro, the first sociological study of its kind in the country that has all the themes of fair housing in it. looking at morals, looking at decency, looking at systemic and structural racism in the 6th Ward of Philadelphia. Also penned The Souls of Black Folk. He was the founder of the Niagara movement that morphed into him working with his Jewish colleagues that brought about what we have now today, NAACP. He argued that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. We can fast forward and say that the problem of the 21st century is also the problem of the color line. What does Du Bois in context mean by the color line? Du Bois is talking about systemic and structural racism. He's talking about white supremacy, and that's not an indictment against white individuals. But Du Bois said that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And on all sides of the color line, people have problems. But in our democracy, oftentimes, we look at Black people from a deficit. This is the Souls of Black Folk, as if they are the problem. They have problems, but they are not a problem people. None of us are problem people. We all have frailties. We all have challenges. Next slide. I thought it was very appropriate to lift a quote from Benjamin Franklin. I'm sitting on the bench of the statue of Ben Franklin on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania, where I graduated from the School of Social Policy and Practice. I also was a professor in the School of Social Policy and Practice. I worked for the W.E.B. Du Bois Collective Research Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. And I was always amazed at how during graduation and various times throughout the year, there would be students on the white side of the color line and other sides of the color line that would always take a picture with Ben Franklin. And some African-American students would take a picture with Ben Franklin. And so one particular day I said, you know what, I'm gonna bring some soul in the same manner of, W.E.B. Du Bois, Souls of Black Folk. I'm gonna bring some soul to this bench where Ben Franklin sits. And so this is me, much younger, much heavier, not body shaming myself. You see the diamond earring. I said, I'm gonna bring some soul to Ben Franklin. But the quote really was appropriate for what we're gonna discuss today. Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. I said this at the conference last year. President Barack Obama had it wrong when he said we are not red states, we are not blue states, we are the United States. The paradigm shift for me is it's okay to be red. It's okay to be blue. Ben Franklin talks about levels of civility. We need levels of civility no matter what side you're on. What we saw in Tennessee was not levels of civility. What we see in Mississippi is not levels of civility. What we see with appraisal biases is not levels of civility. It's not even levels of humanity. It's inhumane the way people are treated in our democracy with regards to gross fair housing negligence, with regards to appraisal bias, with regards to sexual harassment in housing and the like. Next slide. This is where it's going to get interactive. I want you to put in the chat what your neurotransmitters transmit to you when you see this slide that says 1619. Let's put it in the chat. Just the first thing that comes to mind when you see 1619. Slavery, legitimate history, beginning, slavery, Ben Franklin, outrage, great book and research, beginning of slavery, invisibility, beginning of slavery. I think about the 1619 Project. Okay, let's spend a few more moments. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This quote is, "It is certain in any case that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have." Put in the chat who you think said this. Who is this attributed to? Let's test our knowledge. Someone said James Baldwin. Let's get some more. Someone said Langston Hughes, FDR, Calvin Butts. When I found out my Gallup ancestors 1613 committed genocide of the native peoples and enslaved Africans, I was horrified. Okay. Thank you so much, Rachel. It's good to have you here, Rachel Branch, another dear colleague. Someone said, I have said that, but not so eloquently. Okay. Someone said James Baldwin. Okay. And if you're putting more thoughts in the chat, please feel free. This is a quote attributed to the great Jimmy Baldwin. And when we look at power in the moment that we find ourselves, we'll say that it's not engaged in a form of indoctrination. Power allied with ignorance, when it converges, will tell us that critical race theory is being taught in middle schools. Critical race theory is being taught in high schools. Power allied with ignorance will tell us that when you have individuals who are saying, we want sensible gun violence, will simply say, you know what, we're going to expel you from your position. Next slide. This quote is, I'm not anxious to be the loudest voice or the most popular, but I would like to think that at a critical moment, I was an effective voice of the voiceless, an effective hope of the hopeless. Who stated this? Let's go to the chat. Who do you think said this? Someone said, again, I've said this too, but perhaps John Lewis. I like the fact that our colleague here is attributing things to themselves. Rachel said, maybe John Lewis. Okay, let's get some more. Let's get some more. And the reason why I'm setting this up is because we can come back to these quotes. Someone said Whitney M. Young Jr., Shondell, Kelly Ryan. Thank you. Frank said MLK. Thank you, Frank. Someone said John Lewis, good trouble. Someone said Whitney M. Young Jr. Yes, this quote was attributed to Whitney M. Young Jr., a social worker, was the president and CEO of the National Urban League. People say died much too young, died when he was supposed to die. We all have a date with that destiny. It's how we live. It's not the day that we're born. It's not the day that we die. It's what we do with that dash in between. Do we use our lives as a vehicle to alleviate the suffering of others? Do we do what Mother Teresa said when she said, I find joy in transcending self to serve others? Not others that look like me, not others that share the same faith as me. Finding joy to transcend self to serve others no matter what. That's what the beloved community is. You're atheist agnostic, come into the beloved community. You're Republican, come into the beloved community. You're a white nationalist, come into the beloved community. You're engaged in Black victimization, come into the beloved community. If you engage in forms of institutional racism, come into the beloved community. It's a loving community, the highest form of love, agape love. It's not a touchy-feely community. It's not tiptoe through the tulips community. It's not a we shall overcome community. It's a community that says, come in. All are welcome. Bring your darkness. You're going to be faced with light. Bring your white supremacist ideology. We're going to show you that there's another way to deal with your wretched humanity. Not your wretched soul, but a form of ideology that prides itself on white superiority against the backdrop of all of us being human, made in the image of something larger than ourselves. Next slide. One had better die fighting against injustice than to die like a dog or a rat in a trap. Who is this quote attributed to? Who do you think this was? Who do you think this was? Ida B. Wells Barnett. Okay. Love to hear more of your story, Jada. Ida B. Wells said this on the battlefront. Ida B. Wells, thank you, Mondell. Thank you, Kelly. I'm not saying that you're right. I want to see some more. Okay, Ida B. Wells. Let's get some more. Let's get some more. Let's get some more to put some in the chat. If you haven't participated, Amiri Baraka. Thank you, Keith. Whether we get it right, the fact that we know names on every side of the color line, gender line, however people express themselves, is just a testament to, you know, our knowledge base of people who, I like the individual who said, I've said this before, but maybe not like this person. Okay. This is attributed to Ida B. Wells, who, as we know, engaged in, thank you, Pamela Goodwin, who said Malcolm X. But this was a quote attributed to Ida B. Wells, who was a crusader against anti-lynching, who talked about fighting from a standpoint of resistance, fighting against the injustices, or as Claude McKay, the Jamaican poet, mentioned, if we must die, let us nobly die. Next slide. And so we end in this space with this quote: the greatest movement for social justice our country has ever known is civil rights movement. And it was totally rooted in a love ethic. We oftentimes forget that King's identity was multifaceted. He was a fair housing advocate who comes from the South to the North and saw colonies of despair in Chicago and the tenement squares, or what Doug Massey in his book American Apartheid called the creation of the ghetto. Let's look at who this person was who said this quote. Someone said Bell Hooks. Shondell and others, you're vastly becoming my BFFs in this virtual space. I just want to let you know. Let's get some others to put in the chat who you think this was attributed to. The great MLK. Okay, Nicola. Shondell is in agreement that she's okay with being my social justice BFF. I love it. Stretch yourself, colleagues. There's 151 of us on here. Let's stretch ourselves. Angela Davis, okay. Dr. Derek Bell, Faces in the Bottom of the Well. Thank you, Arthur Butler. Has an amazing book, Ethical Ambition. Taught at Harvard University there when women on all sides of the color line, gender line didn't get tenure and went over to NYU. Maya Angelou, Bell Hooks. Okay, this was in fact attributed to Bell Hooks. May she rest in power. Bell Hooks was an amazing change agent who talked about love. She has a book entitled The Killing Rage, but within the confines of that book, there's themes of love. Okay, so thank you for your participation in that space. We're going to now move over to our next slide. There's a lot of there's one more quote. Rarely do we find men who willingly engage in hard, solid thinking. There's an almost universal quest for easy answers and half-baked solutions. Nothing pains some people more than having to think. That oftentimes is the truth. Who said this? Who is this quote attributed to? Fair Housing Conference said MLK. Shondell said MLK. Rachel said, I wish I had. You're doing your job though, Rachel. Julie Thompson said MLK. Rosa Handy said MLK. Thanks for your participation. Thank you, Keith. Danielle, MLK. Okay. In fact, this was Martin Luther King Jr. So now we'll move to the next slide. Thank you, everyone. And speaking of King, we have multiple definitions. If you were in this space last year or the year before when I did this presentation, I always stick to this definition of racism. I don't deviate. I respect definitions that come from David Wellman and his work, Portraits of White Racism, where he says, racism is prejudice plus power, which gives us institutional racism. The work of Paul Kivel, certainly the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, Ibram Kendi, anti-racism. But I stick with this definition from King. King said, racism is a philosophy based on a contempt for life. It is the arrogant assertion that one race is the center of value and object of devotion, before which other races must kneel in submission. It is the absurd dogma, King calls it a dogma, that one race is responsible for all the progress of history and alone can assure the progress of the future. Next slide. King further goes on to say, racism is total estrangement. It separates not only bodies, but minds and spirits. Inevitably, it descends to inflicting spiritual and physical homicide upon the outgroup. Some of us on here may be aware of this definition of racism from King, or the previous quote from King. We like to sanitize King. We like to clean King up. We like to move away from this part of King, the revolutionary, radical King, who talked about the triple evils of militarism, poverty, and racism. The King who spoke out about the Vietnam War. As long as King was in that integration mode, King was a darling to many people. When King moved and started talking about a global destiny of how we're an inextricable garment of how we're tied into one another. I haven't been to Mississippi, but I know that I can afford pure water here in Philadelphia and Harrisburg in the state of Pennsylvania. And we'll build more to what do we do with our privilege? We don't give our privilege up. How do we use our privilege to leverage it on behalf of those who are oppressed or marginalized? Next slide. We come back to Du Bois in this slide, where Du Bois talks about either the United States will destroy ignorance, or ignorance will destroy the United States. Ban the books, but not assault weapons. Stories on Bayard Rustin. Stories on Rosa Parks. The mere fact that we don't see the intersection of white allies who are in the history books, who worked on behalf of Black, brown, and others so that they can receive full humanity. And we'll get into that. Next slide. So I think it's important to, when we're looking at forms of oppression, I characterize it within these four spheres: ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and eternalized. Ideological is what we're seeing going on in Texas, what we see going on in Florida, the ideological wars that we see. Once again, the banning of the books, the ginning up of fears of critical race theory, the replacement theory, white supremacist ideology, white victimization. There's someone else, Noel talks about this in the scapegoat hypothesis. There's someone else that is taking away our jobs. There's immigrants at the border. Institutional. It's very important. When I got to the PHRC, John, and Jamie Williamson can attest to this, that though we're the top civil rights enforcing agency in the Commonwealth, I needed someone to come and train us, to deprogram us, to reprogram us. And I had the Anti-Defamation League come in and do implicit, explicit bias training. White staff, Black staff, others. Executive Director Lassiter, Chad, whatever. Why are we having someone train us? Because we're isms. I would be disingenuous to the 153 people on this virtual space in this beloved community to simply say, never have I ever not engaged with a form of toxic masculinity. Never have I ever not had some form of isms. So the institutional aspect, that's the prejudice plus power. That's the mass incarceration. That's the fair housing violations. That's the appraisal bias. When we look at these forms of oppression, let's move, and some of you have, and some of us need to come and join your efforts, that there are DEI trainings or anti-racism training for banks, for mortgage brokers, for those who are engaged in underwriting, the stuff that Ronstein talks about in The Color of Law. And then it's the interpersonal forms of oppression that we want others to feel our pain. The internalized is what Frantz Fanon calls, those who have been oppressed are starting to mimic the behavior of the oppressor. That's why we don't turn on the nightly news in any part of our democracy and we hear concepts like white on white violence. We hear black on black violence. That's internalized oppression. That's Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask. Next slide, please. Make no mistake that these conversations, colleagues, are not easy conversations. They're hard conversations. They're hard conversations for those of us who, national experts, those of us who teach it. I'm almost certain that there are, all of us at some point or another, sometimes our words are trapped. But I don't believe you can have social justice dialogues without these. I think there has to be conversations on white supremacy, not an indictment against white individuals. I think you have to have conversations on imperialism. Conversations have to occur with regards to colonialism. Conversations on anti-Semitism. Pennsylvania last year was ranked number 8th in the country amongst hate groups assembling. Our current governor is a brilliant man. Our current governor is a person, as a man of faith. I keep him in prayer as a Jewish governor against the backdrop of anti-Semitism. But I also keep other Jewish colleagues, other Jewish friends, reflections. And newsflash, I do it for AAPI hate, and certainly for LGBT, and certainly for Native American Indigenous. And I live in the Black body, and I understand the anti-Black racism that occurs ad nauseum, that brings about the Black fatigue or the racial fatigue. But these social justice dialogues, conversations absent and void of these things, I find somewhat troubling and deeply problematic. You have to have conversations if you're going to be talking about social justice against the backdrop of injustice, or what my mentor Cornel West says, how did we become so maladjusted to injustice? Conversations on white nationalism, and not white nationalism from the standpoint of the Ku Klux Klan. I was in this space with you all once before, and so for some of you, you heard me say this. Charlottesville, those individuals did not adorn the white sheets. Those were our doctors. They were our lawyers. Sadly to say, they were our Sunday school teachers. They were our bankers. They were our neighbors. Some of you may have thought psychologically, consciously, and subconsciously, what does he mean about a crumbling democracy? What does that mean? It's a fractured democracy. It's a democracy that got the first African-American president of the United States and then labeled itself America's post-racial, when we all fundamentally, or we should foundationally know that post-racial is a mirage. And so let's get out of our way when we hear terms like white supremacy and white nationalism. Don't personalize it. But that is one of the diseases of our democracy. King spoke out about white supremacy and white nationalism. He did it with truth, love, and kindness. Rabbi Abraham Yahshua Heschel spoke out about white supremacy and white nationalism. He did it with truth, love, and kindness. And there are those of you who speak out about white supremacy, white nationalism, embedded in policies, whether that's mass incarceration, stop and frisk, appraisal, biases, so forth. Next slide, please. Thanks so much, John. Social justice dialogues must include conversations on white privilege, conversations on white anger, conversations on white allyship. Black people need to know the story of John Brown. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote an autobiography on the great John Brown. Black people and white people and all people need to know about the white allies who worked with Frederick Douglass, who started historical Black colleges and universities. Rachel is on here. Without breaching confidentiality, there have been some dark moments in my position here at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And there have been times where Rachel has said, come on my show and heal. And there have been times where I said, Rachel, other than the show, I just want to come to the catchment area where you're at to put my head on your shoulder, to heal from the trauma of the moment. Jamie Williamson is such a person. So when we look at white allyship, we need to be highlighting those individuals who have worked on behalf of Black humanity and other forms of humanity, and not just from the historical standpoint, in the contemporary. And then we need to push the paradigm to a level where we don't call ourselves white allies or white accomplices. We're just fundamentally good people working on behalf of brothers and sisters and others in our democracy. Conversations have to occur around the convergence of white anxiety, white violence, white victimization. That's what we're seeing in our democracy. Black people have problems, but are not a problem people. That's the seminal work back to the souls of Black folk. You're not going to see a Black Ku Klux Klan. You're not going to see whites who move to a level where they're no longer the majority, and then someone's going to oppress and marginalize them, rendering them non-person, non-entity. So the white anxiety with the white anger leads to the white violence. Next slide. I want you to just look at this for a moment. I'll give you the context. I want you to look at it. I want you to read it. I want to be vulnerable, John, because I wasn't so certain that I was going to allow myself to be vulnerable in this space to talk about the Ku Klux Klan in York, PA, on the hills of Spike Lee's film, The Black Klansman, being shown at a movie theater. And the Ku Klux Klan, they put their propaganda, their white supremacist nationalist propaganda on the window shields of multiple vehicles that were parked in the movie theater, recruiting individuals to join their movement. We launched a No Hate in Our State town hall, which speaks back to the challenges that communities are dealing with because of the surge of white nationalism, white supremacy, and white violence. And then that Crispus Attucks Center, the grand dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, was fidgeting in the seat. I didn't know if he had a gun, but I knew that he was mumbling some things that just did not seem like it was part of the larger pretext or the context. So during the question and answer period, he said he wanted to speak. And multiple people murmured, "Oh, no, don't let him speak." I saw his humanity, as wretched as it was. And I made the comment, the only difference between him and the rest of you, or some of you, is that he has the courage of his convictions to come and speak what he feels. Because King talked about, it wasn't a white supremacist. Those of you who were in the chat, if I quote this wrong, clean it up for me, I give you permission. But I think King said it was the moderate who you had to be concerned about, right? The moderate. King knew where he stood with the white supremacists. The letter from a Birmingham jail was King speaking to those theologians who told him, you just wait. I use this word as not a term of endearment, but because of the context. The Negro preachers, I'm giving you the context, I'm not calling anyone Negroes. The Negro preachers of the North didn't rock out with King. That's vernacular for, they didn't look at King as that person that they can work with. They thought he was just a loudmouth preacher. So this is Morrow, who writes for the York Daily Record. He said, a representative of the Ku Klux Klan spoke at the PA Human Relations Commission Wednesday night. It became an opportunity for Chad Lassiter to showcase advanced humanity. But what nobody captured were those Black staff that ended up coming to my office in Harrisburg the following day and said, ED, a lot of people were complaining about last night on the Facebook Live and what you did. They said that you were like in the movie, the movie escapes me, but the movie where they said the guy was in the sunken place. Put it in the chat, whatever that movie was. And I said, the sunken place, get out. And I said, do they think that? Or do you think that as a Black person? See, for me, it's not about retribution. In my DNA is 400 years of oppression and slavery. But none of the 154 people who are on the white side or the other side of the color line are responsible for that. So I don't engage in an internalized oppression and simply say that I suffer from a post-traumatic slave syndrome disorder. Let me go and attack white people. No, I saw his humanity. I didn't agree with the things that he was saying. And when he left, I said, no, come back. Welcome to the beloved community. But this is nothing new. I meet with Ku Klux Klan members. I meet with white nationalists. I meet with white supremacists all the time in the state of Pennsylvania. And that's an actual quote. We have to see his humanity. I told him about Ira Katz Nelson's work when affirmative action was white. I told him about John Hope Franklin's work from slavery to freedom. Not the work, but I cited some things. But once again, the beloved community says, come on in. And so the no hate in our state town halls are still going on, where it's not a reactive thing. It's how do we support communities where they can build upon using the strength of community to speak back to white nationalism and the surge of white supremacy, not just because of a gentleman like this, but sometimes in our policies, pushing back against LGBT ordinances in certain places of the Commonwealth. Some of the policies with regards to stop and frisk, some of the policies with regards to, the fair housing, commercial property, public accommodations, Crown Act, being discriminated against because of your hair, sexual harassment in the workplace. Next slide. I believe that the beloved community has to have connections that are genuine. Nobody needs to placate, ingratiate, display with false generosity. Genuine connections, authentic connections, transparent connections. The transparency sometimes is hard because we're oftentimes not our authentic selves. We need to support people who engage in forms of authenticity. The aspect of being transparent also brings about forms of self-introspection, self-liberation. Next slide. Privilege in action. White male privilege, male privilege. I'm sitting down right now. I'm 6'6". I never walk on any college campus fearing that something's going to happen to me. I was a professor at the University of Penn and Westchester University, combined universities, about 14 years of teaching as a professor. But I was faced with female students who were victims of date rape. I was faced with students who would say that they would walk down Locust Walk on the campus of University of Penn, or on the main campus at Westchester University, or the urban campus in downtown Philadelphia of Westchester University, where construction workers, and I'm not trying to generalize or stereotype or disparage them, would whistle, say obscene things to them. So there's a form of male privilege. There's a form of class privilege. I'm not the same Dion Lassiter that grew up poor in North Philadelphia. I benefit from a level of class privilege. My mom went to the University of Penn. My mom went to the University of Southern California. I worked at the University of Penn. I graduated from the University of Penn. There's something that when John Fisher says, the president of the Black Men at Penn School of Social Work Incorporated, I can pick up the phone, and I have to get a Governor Rendell on the phone when he was the mayor and the governor. May he rest in power and in peace. Pick up the phone to call Senator Arlen Specter, who was one of my mentors. There's a difference if I'm Dion Lassiter, the president of Black Men at Lincoln University at HBCU. So we have class privilege. But we must use that privilege to call out the racial elephants in the room, in fair housing, in employment, in every single space and sphere, and leveraging privilege on behalf of the humanity. This aspect, this bullet is leveraging privilege on behalf of humanity concept is a concept in which, how do we intervene when we see people being discriminated against, folk being sexually harassed in the workplace, folk being looked over for promotion because they're women or because they're LGBT. So I started this presentation as a servant leader, thanking our colleagues from ASL, because when the pandemic hit, we were doing virtuals, PHRC Social Justice Lecture Series, PHRC Diversity Speaks, PHRC Speaks Fair Housing in the 21st Century without ASL. But we're a civil rights enforcement agency. So we had to say, we need a ASL. In the Philadelphia office, it wasn't until our hearing examiner got hired that we came to the vast realization that our doors were not ADA accessible, bathroom and otherwise. So we're all a work in progress, even those of us who do this work. How do we increase our greater angels and fight back our greater demons? Next slide. I think a book that's really appropriate for the times that we're in, King's book, Chaos or Community. Where do we go from here? And I believe that this is important because there are certain social justice ingredients of the beloved community that I try to make sure I operate with on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. It's not merely to just speak truth to power. Tell the truth. Bear the truth. Let truth be your guiding scaffold as it relates to social justice and social change. King goes from Time Magazine Man of the Year to the most hated and vilified man on the soil of our democracy. A great DVD film is The Wilderness, King in the Wilderness. So the truth has to be told. I just happen to do it with love. There are those of us who know about those colleagues to the left and the right who are engaged in housing discrimination. We know about those gentrifiers that are savaging and ravaging communities and displacing people. The next social ingredient, I believe, is love. A profound, abiding love for humanity. An agape love, not a plurist or eros love, but an agape love, the highest form of love. I'm not saying everyone should do this. I'm just saying where I'm at the age of 50, where my humanity has taken me, where a love for humanity. Oh, there's some criticisms. 5 years in, we're now just doing a disability conference this upcoming July. There's some criticisms. We've operated a lot of times with AAPI hate and anti-Black hate and anti-Semitism. But there's some challenges in our Native American indigenous populations and other populations. Next slide. A level of kindness. A level of kindness. I'm an intellectual. I'm a pragmatist, so I'm gonna try this one out here. There was a police officer who's Hispanic in the city of Philadelphia at Temple University. He was murdered by a white male. And I stood at a community forum and I said, let's have a moment of silence. Not a moment of sympathy, but a moment of silence for the officer who lost his life. And a moment of silence for the individual who took the life. It's just where I'm at within the beloved community. It's real. It's real. And so for those of us who are BIPOC on this call, what Dylan Roof did in that church by taking those lives was horrific. And he was taken alive. And I'm not saying that he should have not been taken alive. But certainly Tyree Nichols, and certainly Tasha McKinnon, and certainly Eric Garner, and certainly George Floyd should have not died at the hands of state-sanctioned violence. But those of us on this call who are on another side of the colored line, we're not dismissing whiteness, for whiteness has been that allure in the democracy. We're saying that Black lives matter because oftentimes the knee that Colin Kaepernick took didn't kill a person. The knee that Derek Chauvin took killed George Floyd, where he yells that most beautiful of phrases, the most beautiful thing on the face of the earth in my mind, Mama! And so what we see is the humanity in others to practice this level of kindness. Next slide. Or what Brian Stevenson talks about in his book, Just Mercy, a pedagogy of just mercy, a paradigm shift where we want redemption, not retribution. We had a teacher in Southern York, PA, who adorned blackface, a white teacher. She was a principal, she was separating her educators that she was doing a training for into teams of two, similar to the Family Feud and Steve Harvey. She's okay by doing that. You don't have to go all the way with the blackface. And who in the 21st century does not know that blackface and racial satire is anti-Black racism, rooted in white supremacy and white ideology that comes from D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, the mocking of Black humanity, the discounting of Black intelligence. We're not a monolith. We are, in fact, human against the historical backdrop of science that tried to prove that we were less than. Next slide. So just in sum, for this, we have overt white supremacy. If you've never seen this model, we can share this model with you. It's similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but we see lynching, hate crime, swastikas. We see KKK, the N-word being used. Oh, but they use the N-word. They put it in their lyrics. They're using the N-word all the time. The burning of crosses, racist jokes. When we look at anti-Semitism, we no longer have to say, well, I didn't know that person was Jewish because their last name is different. No anti-Semitism. Doesn't matter if your last name is not Kern, Littman, Stern, Katz, Berkowitz, Schwartzman. For George Fredrickson, in his work, A Short History of Racism, talked about how religious persecution tied into Jewish identity had many Jews during that era hiding their Judaism and their identity. Make America great. What about make America accountable for some of the crimes of the past? Hiring discrimination, discriminatory practices in lending, mass incarceration, police brutality, police murdering POC, people of color, racial profiling. White mothers and white fathers and white communities, they have a talk, but it's not historical. The talk sometimes, when I talk to white mothers and white families, is I talk to my child about how I love the fact that, I don't love, but I feel more at ease when my son or my daughter is incarcerated because of their opioid addiction, because when they're not incarcerated, they can't get the help that they want. And when they do the nefarious things that they do, they can lose their lives. Different from Black mothers and Black fathers and Black communities. Have a talk. I see Arthur Butler right here. I think Arthur would nod in affirmation. When we give the talk, it's about when the police stop you. Yes, no, sir, depending on where you're at. If you're in the South, you better not eyeball. You think you're uppity. If you're in the North, hands up, don't shoot. We're talking about banning books. We're talking about indoctrination. Anglo-conformity against the backdrop of American exceptionalism, against the backdrop of acculturation. That's what Eurocentric curriculums are in American democracy. The concept of believing we're post-racial, denial of racism, denial of white privilege, the virtuous victim narrative, not believing in experiences of people of color, perceived, real, or imagined, when they come to us at the PHRC. Divorce ourselves from our biases. Look for probable cause when sometimes it's right there. Don't just make it up, look for it. The school to prison pipeline, I would like to say community to school to prison pipeline. The deficits that exist in the community. The bootstrap theory. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Racist mascots. Daniel Snyder held on to the allure of whiteness with regards to the washed redskins. Illinois fighting the Illini, the tomahawk, color blindness. If you don't see my blackness, because I certainly see your color, tokenism. We're still in an era where we're talking about the first Black woman to the Supreme Court, the first woman this, the first Black person that, the first person of color that. This space that we're in, whether it's DEI, whether it's JEDI, whether it's EIB. I want to do a longitudinal study to see where we're at come the year 2030. Are we still as committed to DEI at the height of what happened to George Floyd? Next slide. The role of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. As I stated before, we're in our 68th year. We've had 2 contracts, EEOC and HUD. We're guided by the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. We now do our EEOC initiative, Linguistics Matter. We changed the word, John and colleagues, from contract to initiative, because contract, you're investigating for the contract. No, we're investigating for themes of justice. Next slide. Thank you for bearing with me, colleagues. We will open it up. I'm mindful of our time. We will open it up for Q&A. We have police powers. The PHRA is an exercise of the Commonwealth's police power for the protection of the welfare, prosperity, health, and peace of the people of the Commonwealth. The people of the Commonwealth, on all sides of the color line and gender line, should not have to live in a space where they're discriminated against. When I first got to PHRC, I said, tell me about housing discrimination on the white side of the color line. Executive Director Lassiter, do you mean like in rural PA? No, in urban PA and suburban PA. One of our sections talks about civil right, the opportunity of an individual to obtain employment for which he or she is qualified without discrimination is declared to be a civil right enforceable under the PHRA. Next slide. We talked about our Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, our Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. These are the statutes. We just passed regulations for the first time in several years pertaining to our LGBT regulations, where people need to, once again, not be discriminated against because of gender or sexual orientation or how they identify themselves as. Next slide. Some of you are aware of the PHRC, so just thank you for staying in a moment. I don't come to any space assuming people know who the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission is. What is covered under our act? Employment, housing, commercial property, public accommodations. Next slide. Complementary federal statutes, you can see that for yourself. We're locked in with all the other things that are happening around our democracy. Next slide. Our protected classes, you can see this slide here, all the protected classes that we're with. Next slide. Protected classes that are, once again, continued here: disability, protection from retaliation, familial status, only in housing, sex. Next slide. Over the past year, you'll see some of this data within, the annual report that I'm going to make readily available for you. The top 3 bases of discrimination in housing was disability, retaliation, race and color, and public accommodations, disability, race and color, retaliation and sex, employment, folk being retaliated against, disability, sex, education, disability, retaliation, race and color. Next slide. It's important for us to not be an either or organization, but to be a both and. That's why I say linguistics matter. When I got to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, it was hard to really bring to everyone's mindset what it meant, what I meant about the beloved community, why training was appropriate, why we needed to get out into the community, why it wasn't just about our federal dollars, but it was really about how do we get into the community, use community from a strengths-based perspective, partner with our advisory councils, which are more than our eyes and ears. They're angels in disguise, because they are the ones that are over various catchment areas in the Commonwealth that can let you know where discrimination is happening in the 67 counties. And so we do workshops around civil rights and filing the complaint, civil rights law in the PHRC's jurisdiction, PHRC overview on how to file a complaint. Currently, John and colleagues, we have 2 racial incidents that are happening in schools. I can't really speak about it, but it's in the newspaper. I can just simply say that we're teaching communities that the way that the PHRC helps communities is when you file a complaint. So you can say, oh, they called my daughter the N-word, or they're, you know, my son was disrespected or discriminated against because of disability or because of LGBT status. You know, we hear those salient cries, but for us, from a policy standpoint, it's about filing. We also want to prevent discrimination in the workplace and schools. So we do cross-cultural communication, conflict resolution, sexual harassment in the workplace, sexual harassment prevention, preventing bullying and harassment. In Spirit, a lot of you colleagues on here know that that's from the United States Department of Justice. And Spirit, really, the acronym escapes me, but they do an amazing, phenomenal job of giving students the space to use their voice, to use their agency to speak back against some of the things that are happening in school. And then you see fair housing. You know, we're in Fair Housing Month. As you can see here, we do fair housing fundamentals for the community. We, with our brilliant director of fair housing commercial property, Adrian Garcia, we're always doing back to basics for the PHRC staff in the housing space, but fair housing for municipal leaders, fair housing in criminal backgrounds, workshops on fair housing and domestic violence, because there is an intersection of that, fair housing in individuals with disabilities, fair housing and hoarding, maybe some things that you all are doing and maybe you haven't thought about. We'll be more than open to sharing with you some of our fair housing materials, some of our infographics, things of that nature, fair lending, affirmatively furthering fair housing, redlining yesterday and today, looking at it from a historical standpoint to a contemporary. Next slide. This is important because you heard me earlier talk about no hate in our state town halls. We now have communities doing their own, not in our community. They couldn't borrow our moniker, no hate in our state town hall. That's our social justice branding. But you have communities that are now talking about incidences of crimes, biases. So as you can see, the beloved community is being expanded. If you look at the pictures closely, Desiree Chang, that's our director of education. Lau Wood, he's our regional director in Pittsburgh, regional office, and everyone else are individuals who are friends within the social justice milieu to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. So once again, we transferred the concept of no hate in our state town halls. We still do it, but when communities are faced with hate, we'll simply say, hey, listen, why don't the community go ahead and activate a not in our community? And they do that. And if you want us to support, we can put the flyer together, which as you see, we did it in partnership. We can put some people on the panel, if that's what you want us to do, or we can just support you in any kind of way that we can support you, because there are strengths in communities. Next slide. We also build the beloved community through social justice lecture series. As you see here, some of you are familiar with Dr. Eddie Glaude out of Princeton University. He's on MSNBC, one of the foremost thought leaders in our country. He did a PHRC social justice lecture series on lessons from the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If you see on the left-hand side, we partner with a historical Black college, Lincoln University, because we believe that it's our obligation to really start training the next students of civil rights and human rights leaders, not just at HBCUs, but we also are partnering with Senator Art Haywood in this initiative called Enough. The acronym escapes me, but essentially it's ending racism on college campuses, lots of hatred, lots of microaggressions towards students of color. You also see to my right, Nicole Tyler for Women's History Month. She did a More Than a Highway construction project, looking at a human-centered approach to advancing equity, inclusion, and belonging in transportation. Next slide. Last year, we had a Women's History Month. We're one of the few organizations that puts on a Women's History Month event once a week for every week in the month of March. This was last year. We had Juju Chang from ABC News at Nightline, Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate. She spoke about that. We also had Lieutenant Colonel Custodio for Hispanic Heritage Month, gave a keynote address on overcoming doubt and imposter syndrome, which is something that is pervasive in a lot of us, that we're doing a lot of this work. And sometimes we find ourselves in this space where it's like, I can't believe that that's me, or I can't believe that someone is lauding me for that. Sometimes we need to take a step back and engage in the 3 R's, renew our spirits, recharge ourselves, but also reward ourselves. You know, once again, Wayfinders, John, all of the organizers, here we are, 17th year. May not be in person, but we're here in spirit. Reward ourselves for the gains that we've made, interacting with new people, seeing former colleagues, getting reconnected, learning new things, stretching ourselves intellectually and as pragmatists and just as human beings trying to serve this democracy. Next slide. We also had a social justice lecture series looking at a 2020 vision for America, building bridges, not walls, with Todd Quinones. It's important for me to also have others pour into me. Not, oh, Dion, Lassiter, national expert on race relations. And no, I need to hear from others. And so Todd ended up coming in, and Quinones ended up coming in and sharing his 2020 vision for America. One of my former students, that's one of the great things about being in this space, is that you can reach back and bring students who you've mentored. This is Amber Hikes. She was one of my students at the University of Penn. She ended up coming in talking about the intersectional allyship within the LGBTQ plus community for Pride Month. Next slide. Other aspects of the beloved community, social justice lecture series that featured Dr. Walter Palmer, Black resistance throughout the decades. We started with 1619. We could talk about slavery. We can talk about Reconstruction. We can talk about Jim Crow. The slide to the right was PHRC did a conference in Philadelphia on the Crown Act, so that people can understand the provisions of the Crown Act, but within the confines of the conference was just full-fledged conversations with panelists talking about how to address and bring awareness to hair discrimination. And we had the author of the national bill, Ajwa Asama, from the White House. She was the first national czar for race that Biden tapped, and she works with Secretary Marcia Fudge of HUD. She was our keynote speaker. Next slide. Once again, just giving you just some things that we're doing at the PHRC that I think that, some of you may be doing these things. Maybe this will spark an interest in you saying, how you can further social justice missions. We partnered with Temple University Beasley School of Law on October 3rd, 2022. We had Anita Hill, and this was in person. Anita Hill was here talking about the experiences that she went through, but why she continues to stay committed, fighting for justice against the backdrop of violence towards women and others. Her main topical area was violence towards women in the workplace, and it was something just to cherish, being in that space with Anita Hill. We also believe in that beloved community from the perspective of, we gave Anita Hill, just like we did Eddie Glaude and others, our highest award, which is our PHRC Social Justice Equity Award. Next slide. We negotiate all of our relationships. Frances Wolf is the First Lady of Pennsylvania. She was the former governor's wife, and she ended up coming in and doing a topical conversation on dignity and worth of women with children who have formerly been incarcerated. And that was very powerful to hear the narratives of the women that she's worked with. And we were so very gracious that she accepted our offer. And then Dr. Nicole Hollins Sims was 2 years ago, the school psychologist of the year in Pennsylvania. How are the children? building belonging and education against the backdrop of the United Nations talks about how play is essential. And for the global historical pandemic, children were in the isolate stage. And some of the behaviors that we see are being manifested because of that isolation, because of the lack of things that we see occurring in their communities, the shuttering and the closing of libraries and recreation centers and things of that nature. Next slide. As you can see, we try to cover the gamut of all those things, not trying to be all things to all people, but we try to get to a space where we look at all of the challenges that we see in our democracy. So you see, we have Asian racialized trauma, why and why not. We also, for Asian Pacific Islander Month, we had Belonging Begins With Us, Stopping AAPI Hate and Violence for the Long Term. We're moving to a level where I'm getting ready to conclude, and we'll open it up for question and answers. I know there's some things in the chat. Next slide. I can hear Jamie Williamson saying, and her voice, "That's good, my man. What about fair housing?" And I got you, Jamie. PHRC speaks fair housing in the 21st century. The topic was expanding housing protections for LGBTQ plus Pennsylvanians. You see, we even have our commissioner, our chair of our commissioner, Joel Bolstein. He's an amazing human being. He's a partner at Fox Rothschild. He was the guiding force with us making sure that we move our LGBTQ plus regulations, guidances to regulations. He comes out of a storied history of 22 rabbis in his family that can trace their lineage back to sort of the terminology we would use would be a Jewish underground railroad traveling and fleeing persecution from Belarus to our democracy. To the right, PHRC speaks fair housing in the 21st century. The topic was empowering single moms in housing. Next slide. PHR speaks fair housing in the 21st century. One of the foremost sociologists around, Chip Gallagher, was our guest. And most recently, this was April 2nd. And then taking place tomorrow, Beyond the Headlines, coming together to address appraisal bias. I know that Jeffrey Mays is part of this conference. Jeffrey Mays, if he's in this space, and I know this is going to be recorded, I'm going to simply say, thank you for your earnest friendship. Thank you for helping PHRC turn the corner and right those wrongs with regards to our HUD contract that we once had. Thank you for being a thought leader. Thank you for being an expert in the field. Thank you for doing things that you do for PHRC. And thank you for Michael Mitchell as well, another friend to the PHRC. Next slide. Once again, I get ready to close by simply saying, Fair Housing Month is important. We have fair housing trainings, redlining yesterday and today, accessibility and fair housing fundamentals. Once again, this PowerPoint, John can share with you all. We'll go to the last slide. That's just me. And one of the things I wanted to use as I close out is not so much the picture of me, but what Isaiah 6:8 stood for. It says, also, I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here I am, send me. It's a lot of challenges in our democracy as we go to Q&A. Whether you're a person of faith or non-faith, we do this work because there's something larger than us that calls us to this space for such a time as this. A crisis of legitimacy is what sociologists call it. Wars and rumors of wars is what King calls it. But we're here fighting for a better tomorrow to reimagine a different narrative, a beloved community that is possible. Last slide. I would love to stay in contact with you all. This is my Twitter handle, John Fisher. Thank you for allowing me this space on this day at this time. And we'll open it up for questions that you may have, comments that you may have. Within the beloved community, there may be some critiques that you may have.
We
But I'll
could
end by
probably,
saying that I am so appreciative of being in this space today with all of you.
it has been both a pleasure and honor once again to have you here, Chad. We could probably go on for some time. We have about, simply because we have to turn the various lines that we use for this over. We've got about maybe 5-6 minutes to go real quickly if people had questions, comments.
Saw some stuff in the chat. Raymond Moore, great question. If you want to follow up, my email address is classiter@pa.gov. I can get you that answer. Cleveland Horton, he's a dear friend of mine. Cleveland, come off of mute. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my brother, just wanted to give you a shout out, man. I appreciate the as always, just the way you think, your thought process, the way you energize. I think not only me but others in the work. So, man, just wanted to just give you a big thanks, man. Keep going, keep doing the great work that you do individually and the work that you are doing at PHRC. Appreciate just being able to say you're a friend, my brother.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me. Jada, I see your hand up, but I just chose to say Jada because I didn't want to botch your first name.
Well, that's fine. Jada is an important name. It's named after my grandmother's. Also, I just want to say thank you for this. I can't tell you, I particularly enjoyed the questions about the quotes. It really brought me there. And I just wanted to also say it was inspiring. It gets me back in the focus. There's just been some things that we talked about dealing with this every day. It takes a toll on us emotionally and sometimes even physically. But you're giving me inspiration to get back in the fight. And I just want to utilize some of the resources and things that you have. But in the meantime, before I did this, for 20 years, I was her. Oops. Ida B. Wells Barnett. Sorry,
Wow.
you can't hear. That was
Wow.
me. And I met her grandson. And sometimes when things are really bad, I'm always thinking, what would Ida do? So thank you for
Wow.
that. And thank you for the memory lane.
Wow. Thank you. Hey,
There's
Gail,
also-
it's twofold, Gail. You said you have a way of energizing me, but I think as human beings, we don't have enough time, as John said, but thank you for the compliment, Gail. But the gentleman that spoke prior to Jada, Cleveland is an amazing individual. And so, civil rights, human rights spaces, we have a whole lot of people that are just doing some wonderful things.
Okay.
I should also mention in here that there's a couple in the Q&A section. And just one, if you could click on that, we got about 4 minutes more to look there as well. But one thing that was brought up was something that along the line of something I asked about. There's also the fact that some states, such as Massachusetts, for example, has an organization similar to yours. Other states really don't have much in the way of either organizations or protective laws within the states themselves. And someone question had to do with let's see, your stance on HUD's fair housing assistance programs, so-called FAPs, which are within the Fair Housing Act, which sometimes are the closest thing that may be to you in some states.
Yeah, and I saw that question, and we were a FAP as well, and we just decided to not be, but we're still doing housing investigations under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. I want to apologize to Gwen and everyone else, because Gwen says, I'm hoping you can get to questions in the Q&A. Sorry, went over. HUD in Knoxville, Tennessee, never answers the phone. Truly not one time. How do we deal with or complain to? I don't have an answer in a moment, but I know that some colleagues on here would probably have, some advice. Before we go, I did want to say that one book that I recommend is Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow. Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow. It's a book by Henry Louis Gates, Henry Louis Gates Jr. There's another book entitled A Field Guide to White Supremacy, A Field Guide to White Supremacy. The editors are Kathleen Ballou, which is BLOU, Belew, and Ramona Gutierrez. So the title is A Field Guide to White Supremacy. Another amazing book, and there are tons, but I wanted to leave you with these. Democracy, Race and Justice. Democracy, Race and Justice. The Speeches and Writings of Sadie T. M. Alexander. Democracy, Race and Justice. The Speeches and Writings of Sadie T. Alexander. She was the first Black woman to get a PhD in economics in the country. First Black woman to graduate law school from the University of Pennsylvania. My grandmother, Thelma Patterson, was her housekeeper, took care of her prior to her coming down with early onset of dementia. We affectionately as kids called her Miss A for Alexander. Her and her husband was Judge Raymond Pace Alexander. They integrated Girard College along with the NAACP president of the Philadelphia chapter, Raymond Cecil B. Moore. So Judge Raymond Pace Alexander, Miss Alexander, Cecil B. Moore, and Martin Luther King integrated Girard College. You can look that history up. Once again, sorry that we didn't have enough time for Q&A. The goal is to be with one another in spirit as we touch and agree to continue to do what King said. The moral arc of the universe certainly is long, but it continues to build towards justice. Bend towards justice, excuse me. Thank you, John.
Again, thank you so much, Chad. And again, I look forward to seeing you next year in Springfield. Because hopefully we will be doing this both in person and still streaming it for those of you around the country. So now I set a task for us to live up to. So if I don't see you before, hopefully it'll be sooner. I'll see you next year. Thank you, everybody. And just real quickly, want to remind you that at 2 o'clock, we have our next round of workshops, which includes the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, the FACE Act, gender identity and expression testing, and do evictions defund nearby schools. And again, these should all be fairly easy for you to get to at this point. I apologize once again for some of the problems we had this morning with some people getting access. Hopefully we're running a little bit more smoothly now.
One quick question. Can we get a copy of this webinar?
This webinar will be, again, we recorded this webinar. It will be on the website for the Fair Housing and Civil Rights Conference. Again, this is a website worth visiting every now and then because we have a resources section where we have recordings of past events in the conference. This is one of them that will be up. It's going to be probably a couple of weeks or so before we get it up, but we should have both the slides and actually a recording of the actual event. So again, thanks everybody. Have a good day and 2 more days to go.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Chad.
And Jamie, thank you, Jamie, co-host, co-parent of the whole thing.
Thank you.
What's up, Jamie?
Hey, Chad.
How you doing?
Good, good. Great presentation as always.
Hey, the creator is good. It's good to see you. Hey, Rachel.
I see
Come up with me,
Cleveland's here.
Rachel.
Hello.
Rachel Branch, take yourself
Hey,
off of mute.
Rachel.
Hey, you guys get to Rachel on your own. I got to recycle this.
Okay.
website.
All right,
Bye-bye.
John. We'll see you.